Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Roundtable discussion hosted by the Environment and Social Issues Cluster from Nickel and Dime, which is a forum under Center for New Economic Studies. Today's theme of discussion will be climate finance and how it's effective in mitigating climate problems. We have the panelists who are also the members of the cluster. We have Ashish, Rajat, and Sudarshan. And it'll be sort of spearheaded by Shreya, and I'll give my inputs as well. So Shreya, would you like to take over and introduce the topics for the audience?
Hi, everyone. So today, as we know, as Ashika said, the topic under discussion is the effectiveness of climate change for climate financing and adapting to climate change. The question that comes to mind is, what is climate financing? Climate finance refers to the local, national, or transnational financing drawn from public, private, or alternate sources of financing that seeks to support mitigation and adaptation actions and will address the issue of climate change. So, in accordance with the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Convention, parties with more financial resources should come in aid to those parties that need the financial assistance and help them in their battle against climate change. So, access to such financial assistance will not only help countries in their fight against climate change mitigation, which requires large amounts of investments and capital to reduce the emissions, but it will also help in their strive towards adaptation, which also requires significant financial resources, which means adapting to the adverse climate effects that is affecting various countries. So steps to ensure climate finance was taken by various parties, such as setting up, the Green Climate Fund, the Special Climate Change Fund, the Least Developed Countries Funds, and so on. However, setting up such funds and making climate finance available to various parties is just the first step. One of the most important tasks to ensure climate action against climate change is to track the use of this climate finance. So, do any of the panelists think it's been tracked effectively? What are some of the problems that arise with poor tracking and lack of transparency? Over to the panelists.
Okay, so of course there are a few issues with the tracking aspect of it. For example, in 2010 it was promised like 100 billion of aid was promised. A lot of it did not come through even until now. So now, of course, climate finance is something which developing countries have been largely sticking to since COP25, right? To sort of and it's also a good mechanism to enforce accountability with regards to uh, you know, uh, climate change, emissions, and all that. Now, for climate finance, we need to take a whole of economy approach because climate finance is basically whatever you're funding, whatever infrastructure you're building, that needs to be climate sensitive. So now this is something that touches the entire spectrum of government policy decisions. Now, that's one aspect of it. So, and that's how it becomes very tough. Like in the post 2020 stimulus funding that was given by governments all over the world to stimulate their economies, only 12 to 18% of all of that money was climate conscious. Rest was not. So this means like our fundamental thinking approach to policy is still not the way it should be with regards to climate finance. And then also for the tracking aspect of it, now there is another layer. Like people and governments, mostly in the global north, they might think that the money that they are giving to developing countries, the global south, that might be misallocated. There might be corruption. There is a layer of condescension to it, right? You have smoked your way to prosperity over the last 2 centuries, and now you think if you give your money, the developing countries might a lot of that money might get misplaced. Now, I don't think that would be a very sound thing because you can anyway enforce accountability mechanisms to handle how that money is going. The IMF, World Bank, they're very adept in that. So saying that it gets misplaced, I think that's a long shot. It's just too much in the air. So that's not a good way to go about it. And then yeah, actually that's about it. And there's another very important aspect to it, that now that the world is actually, especially our generation, now that we are emphasizing so much on climate finance, climate change, there is an air of sustainability in the air, and companies know that they will have to adapt to it maybe 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, right? So the big, like, the hedge fund managers, etc., these people know that the companies will have to adapt as young people come to power increasingly around the world. So this also means that private sector across the world, they now have to also fund climate finance. And this actually can give them a chance to, sort of layer over whatever the anti-climate things that they have done. So it also, injects an air of consciousness into their decisions, into their operations. Now, this can increasingly lead to enormous sums of money flowing into developing countries, which is also not a very sound thing. Uh, the former governor of England Central Bank, I'm forgetting it was Mike something, but they promised that they have secured 115 trillion in funding for developing countries, as opposed to 100 billion. So there's a billion, there's a trillion. Of course, a lot of difference, right? Unimaginable. So this actually, this actually, we'll have to make sense of it, that the private sector will increasingly fund this thing so that they can hide their other activities, right? And then when the money starts flowing in from the private sector, this will lead to enormous overheating, volatility, inflation, etc. So this is also like enormous sums of money, which is not converting into sustainable infrastructure, because even if it doesn't convert, that's not the problem of the private sector. Their job is just to fund, and their balance sheets will be like, perfectly tuned. So this is something that we have to look into, and the best example for this is Turkey. A lot of money they had recently, like over the last 10 years, from the private sector flowing in, and then they had some problems. The companies got to know that this is unsustainable, they left, and we can see the condition of the Turkish lira. So these are some things that we'll have to keep in mind.
Yeah, Ashish, I just had a counter question regarding that. Your initial point had mentioned how, the government's kind of not conscious of their decision environmentally, right? Which is why for environment, it's a very small percentage of the GDP. Then, isn't that right? That was the point, right?
So yeah, go on.
Yeah, so ideally, wouldn't it mean that it'd be easier to track, this climate financing since it forms such a small percent of the GDP? But why do you think we don't see that happening? You could even, think about it in the case of India.
So I will not see it from the perspective of GDP.
Hmm.
I would rather state that the entire GDP, that is the entire production that is happening in our financial year, that needs to be sensitized towards the climate. And this means whatever infrastructure, the government funding, private investment, domestic consumption, rather I would say private investment more
Yeah,
and government
yeah,
spending more.
yeah.
Okay. Now, these things will have to account for the climate in all their monetary allocations and their investments. So
Okay.
then it becomes a whole of economy approach, rather than just building up solar plants somewhere. That's not how you do it. We
Okay.
need the entire spectrum.
Right, so a macro approach. It's interesting you mentioned private and public, because then the next question would be, because the major right now, the chunk of climate financing comes from the private side. And you had mentioned one problem with that, which is the lack of accountability. For them, it's just the fact that they're investing, which matters. So do you think, and this is open to, of course, all the panelists as well, do you think it's better for the public to invest more than they're doing now, or just to continue in the private climate financing state because it's considered more effective? But then if there's public climate financing, will be considered more accountable because they are answerable to the people. So does anyone want to take that up?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead with this. So I think we live in a world where this binary between private and public money is increasingly getting sort of, uh, more fragile, I would rather say. Because if you think about it, I would rather approach this question from, Karl Polanyi's conception of double movement, where he argues that when the liberals and the private money comes into the picture, right, it creates a sort of pressure on the government as well to protect to protect people from exploitation. So it's sort of a fight between the two. So if I were to approach it like this, I would say that more private money coming into the picture would also invoke the government to sort of act as a welfare machinery, and especially in the context of India, because uh, looking at climate finance and climate change in particular, just from economical sense, doesn't really capture the entire picture. Because in a country like India, you also have to consider about the fact uh, the inequalities which exist, not only between countries, and then there are states. There are some states which are poorer, there are some states which are richer, right? And a private company in that context would rather invest in a city like Delhi, because for them it's more profitable, because it gets the eyeball, right? In that context, government needs to step in. So to sum it up, I would say, again, going back to Karl Polanyi's conception of double movement, that it's an inherent tension between the two parties, which will in the future make it sure that the finance is uh, you know being channeled in a right manner. And if we continue going with these categorical binaries, that either this one or that one should put the money, that would again create this some sort of dystopian world which doesn't exist in reality. Because in every sphere right now, even if you look at CSR activities, CSR is putting a lot of money on in education. But at the same time, you think about education from a rural point of view, the government needs to be there, because the private investor doesn't have any incentive to invest in a rural school, like conceptually speaking. So that inherent tension needs to be, you know accounted for going forward, even in this whole debate about climate finance, climate change, I would say. Yeah.
I think that's
May
actually
I add?
really, yeah, for sure. Go ahead.
Apologies. Yeah. Okay. So essentially, I also share Rajat's sentiment over here. Let me also add that when we talk about whether we think this is the right path forward, then I suppose one could assert that the current ratio or how the balance stands in terms of what private financing and uh, public financing make up of the whole chunk of climate financing, that is a tad bit undesirable. But what is to be kept in mind is private finance by itself is not undesirable. In that it's essentially a mark of shift in market sentiments over a period of time, which is very, very important, because that is the only form of finance that will be sustainable over the years. Because government finance comes from and public finance essentially comes from taxpayer funds, which is in essence to be kept to one-time raises and so on, and not consistent period of expenditures, because that puts a lot more pressure on citizens of the country than private finance does, and hence as with our concerns, a lot less sustainable to keep in supply too. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that, recently WRI also published a report that uh, due to COVID, the private companies have pulled a lot of money out of the whole debate of climate finance, because for them the immediate goal is to rectify or mitigate the COVID crisis. But at the same time, looking at it from a behavior change, uh, you know there are some things which need sustained and constant finance. And if you were to argue that only the private finance can uh, you know uh, help us battling this climate change, I wouldn't agree to that. So that's why I was saying this inherent tension between two parties is actually beneficial, and one should not look at it from either this or that debate, because then it's like making those categories too separate from each other, and then it sort of makes you believe that these two categories cannot work together, which I don't think is the case right now.
I think both of y'all have raised really interesting points because I agree with Rajat, especially given that a lot of the developing countries don't have sustainable, like they haven't have developed capital markets or financial markets at the moment. So for them at this stage, making a distinction between public and private might be difficult, and a play of hand between the two might be the way to mitigate climate finance. But I think Sudarshan also has a valid point in saying that the behavioral change of the markets also matter and the sentiments of the people matter. Which brings me to my next point, which is a large chunk of the people who participate in private financing and private markets are now looking for companies that follow the guidelines and the rules of ESG investing, who believe in the idea that only companies which follow environment, social, and governance guidelines are the companies to be invested in today. And they are fighting in their way towards climate change. So given that, what do your views on ESG investing? And do you think that do you think are the possible consequences of this type of investing on companies that are dependent on oil, reserves, oil-rich nations, and so on? Over to the panelists.
Could I chime in? Okay. I think it's a wonderful development in recent times. ESG investing is something that we can expect to drive more funds toward effectively climate finance, whether for adaptation or mitigation in general. One thing to keep in mind is this in essence is also a mark of a shift in market trends, right? Where fund flows in is now being increasingly becoming climate conscious and green per se, and that is a very, very desirable development, because it's very important to keep in mind that while a lot of emissions in the last century came from oil and natural gas companies, nationalized oil and natural gas companies, a huge chunk is also from the private sector, chunks between here and there, and more effective decarbonization there, and policies, technological developments also that could which through investor pressure, stakeholder pressure, which in turn is through ESG investing, can really help change things on the forefront of private companies and their climate exploits. And so this brings us to the part of the question about the consequences of ESG investing and funding to oil-rich companies and countries. In fact, in recent times, there's been a lot of documents floating around, recommendations, advisors to ESG, based on ESG metrics to oil and natural gas companies, making multiple set of recommendations to in fact strategize for low carbon business models, and effectively focus on developing technologies for decarbonization, prevention, and holding off on further drilling and so on. And I think that's actually a great start at this point in time. In fact, if one of the things that I read a few days ago was that actually one of Saudi Arabia had actually raised a lot of funds in terms of in the form of a green bond for some of these purposes. This isn't necessarily ESG equity funding, but it's important to keep in mind that it also goes part of the way. And it's an oil and natural gas undertaking that did it on the side of South Africa, and that's a great development. I mean, the funds themselves haven't effectively, talking about tracking, they haven't been particularly earmarked for so and so, enumerated purposes, but it's a great development in that investor pressure is showing results, and in one of the greatest oil and natural gas producers of the world, and I think that has already started to go a long way. So in the future, in terms of the consequences of our oil and natural gas companies and oil-rich countries, we can see a lot of efforts coming from them. We can expect to see a lot of efforts coming from them to move towards low carbon operations, positively much less drilling, further new drilling, and so on. That's my part. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sudarshan. So I find it interesting that you're talking about, how existing, let's say, big countries were focused on oil and gas are kind of, slowly transitioning over to, sustainable measures. So similar to the private versus public financing debate is an other sort of polarity which exists in the conservation space, which is whether we should focus on adapting to the existing systems, the existing amount of, let's say, carbon emissions, or should we invest in mitigating, kind of reversing the process, going back to how it was. So focusing on this existing debate, like, what do you think is the difference between climate financing for adaptation versus for mitigation? Because currently we see that mostly activities focused on mitigating climate change is more financed when we look at both private and public. So which one do you think would be better?
So chiming in again, I don't think just the answers for the previous questions, it's as hard a binary as we think it is. Climate change is happening, and so there must be some efforts towards adaptation as well. One of the reason why I believe that there's a lot more funds going in towards climate finance or mitigation is that the sentiments around the world are so. Ashish was talking about in the beginning, there's an air of sustainability currently, and as we were just talking, there's huge investor pressure around the world, and large amount of funds is waiting to go for green purposes per se. And so I think the reason why, and I think the reason why climate finance for mitigation is a lot more larger, in that I think over a period of time people have started to feel the urgency, right? We have the IPCC reports coming in, and so often, and we have a lot of these predictably dystopian reports that warn us about what will happen in the future if we keep striding on this way. And I think that the urgency and the importance of the matter has finally found its way to the ears of private and public funds, and I think that is what is driving the lopsided balance between both. And 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 as I was saying in the beginning, I don't think there is a hard binary over here. There has to be some amount of funds that go towards climate finance for adaptation as well. This is particularly because a lot of countries that will have to adapt more hardly, or put more efforts into adapting, are developing countries, because they're the ones that already lack existing infrastructure to cope with these changes, and are the ones that are expected to be significantly more affected when the things take a turn for the worse. And so it's a two-way street, in that both lanes need to be available. And while and I also wanted to mention that one of the other reasons why climate finance for mitigation may be more preferred is because there have been a lot of hypotheses and modeling that has been brought about, and we've been informed of in recent years, that has stated that climate finance for mitigation might actually be cheaper than adaptation. Taking in mind a few decade view or a century view or so, it's a lot of models. One recent study a couple to 3 years back in Nature journal or so, and many more have actually concluded that based on a certain set of models, this is we can actually estimate climate finance for mitigation to be much more cheaper in comparison to climate finance for adaptation. So that's one thing, and that's more or less it in terms of what I wanted to say. So in summary, it's the shift in sentiments. It's and it may just be cheaper as well, and that it need not be a hard binary that we need to look at. That's about it for me. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Sudarshan. So that brings us to the final question, which is, when we are talking about climate financing, it's kind of, as we see, it's like a joint effort, right? So it's between various nations. There is funding from developed nations to developing nations. So we'll keep this round very quick. So, as you can see, the membership is not permanent, as we saw with the case of United States. So then how will that affect the existing climate financing? Will anyone like to comment on that very quickly?
Exactly. So I think this goes to the heart of the matter, because the way the US government left the climate pact during Donald Trump's presidency, I think this signifies what turn populism can take on climate, right? And it also signifies how forces which are against climate finance, against climate change, against climate obligations in the global north, how they can turn and sway the public against it, and how governments can then capitalize on that. So we need to be very careful on this part, because the US leaving it signifies this in totality, that yeah, governments can leave it if the public thinks so. Now, and also going forward, why this is not like codified in stone, like you cannot leave it. I think this is one of the major flaws in climate negotiations. And of course, governments in the global north do not want to actually sort of incorporate all of that into their constitution, let's say. So they don't want to be bound under those shackles. They will only cough up as much as they think they can during a fiscal year. So I don't think there can be a good solution to that, and because there are a lot of interests involved. So we need to be very careful with this thing. And of course, the global south will have to keep on building pressure to extract the amount that is required, and then choose a mutual way forward. So that's about it. And would anyone else like to chime in?
Yeah, I think those are great points. We were able to, kind of move from the basics and each aspect of climate financing to what is happening right now, what has happened already. We talked about private versus public investing. We had spoken about how it's kind of a joint effort of both, and the tension between both is actually beneficial to climate investing. We talked about investing in adaptation versus mitigation measures. We talked about ESG, which is the upcoming positive development towards sustainable investing. And we kind of ended the discussion with what has happened right now, the how each country has kind of role to play, and we need to the existing organizations kind of need to keep in check, and that the aid between countries is actually beneficial. So this has been a great discussion, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you to the audience, and that will be all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.